It was snowing hard over the Kazakh steppe on the morning of November 15, 1988. Heavy enough that the launch should probably have been scrubbed. It went anyway. The most powerful rocket in the world climbed off its pad at Baikonur and flew a perfect mission. Every stage performed. The core carried its load to the edge of orbit and let go clean. And that was the second time this rocket had ever flown, and it was the last. Within 5 years, it'd be shut down for good, and nobody watching the cleanest launch of their careers knew they were standing at a funeral. The rocket was called Energia, which is just the Russian word for energy. On the day it flew, it was the second most powerful rocket ever built, behind only the American Saturn V, which had stopped flying 15 years earlier. It stood nearly 200 feet tall. It could put more than 100 tons into low orbit, better than 3 times what the American Space Shuttle could carry. And it did it with more thrust off the pad than the shuttle could muster. The strange thing about Energia is that it never failed. It worked, start to finish, both times it flew, and then it was thrown away, and the machine was not the reason. That's what I want to walk through. And Energia is one of the strangest deaths in the history of spaceflight. Strange precisely for the lack of any wreckage to point at. Most dead rockets die because the engineering was wrong. You can name the bad valve or the cracked weld. This one died with the engineering completely, provably right. Every decision that led to it was sensible on its own. Stacked together, those decisions produced the most capable launch vehicle on the planet. So why does a rocket this good end up mothballed in a desert with the paint still fresh? The answer is in the reason it got ordered in the first place, and that goes back to the American Space Shuttle and to a number on a specification sheet that the Soviet military could not explain. The shuttle could carry about 30 tons up to orbit, which was impressive and easy enough to explain. The other figure was the one they couldn't. The shuttle was designed to bring roughly 15 tons back down, in one piece, and land it on a runway. Nothing in the American inventory needed to come home from orbit. Satellites went up and stayed up. Why build a vehicle optimized for returning cargo that, in theory, was never supposed to come home? The man who ran the Soviet Union's Central Space Research Institute, Yuri Mozarin, said it plainly. Nothing was being returned from space, he said, and now they were planning to bring down 820 tons per year. It clearly had a focused military goal. Sit with that reasoning. Study teams at the Keldysh Institute of Applied Mathematics ran the trajectories and reached conclusions that sound insane now and were rational then. A spaceplane that could dip into the atmosphere, cross a continent, and climb back out might swing over Moscow on a single orbit and drop a nuclear weapon before anyone could respond. A machine that could haul 15 tons down out of orbit could just as easily reach up, grab a Soviet satellite, and carry it home to be taken apart. Some of the studies went further and pictured it lifting a laser battle station into orbit and leaving it parked overhead. The shuttle could also swerve more than 1,000 miles to either side of its path on the way down, and to a Soviet analyst that cross-range looked purpose-built for overflying their territory on a single pass. The Soviet leadership looked at that spaceplane and saw a first-strike weapon, and decided they could not afford to be the only side without one. I find it difficult to be too hard on them for that. They were reading intent off of capability, in the dark, in the most dangerous standoff in history, and reading it wrong was the safer way to be wrong. So in 1976 the order came down, driven by the defense minister Dmitry Ustinov and the full weight of the military-industrial machine. The Soviet Union would build its own reusable orbiter, which became Buran, and Buran would need something to lift it, and that something became Energia. From the Soviet perspective, even a small chance that the shuttle had a military role was enough to require a response. The second link is where this quietly turns into a tragedy, and it's also, to me, the smartest engineering call anyone in the whole story made. The launcher landed in the hands of Valentin Glushko, the Soviet Union's most powerful rocket engine designer, and Glushko refused to copy the American layout. The shuttle bolted its main engines onto the orbiter, which meant the entire stack existed to fly that one spaceplane and nothing else. Glushko built Energia the other way around. He made it a real rocket, a standalone heavy lifter that could fly with the orbiter on its side, or without it, carrying anything you cared to bolt on in its place. On paper it was brilliant. It meant the Soviets wouldn't just get a shuttle lifter. They'd get the most powerful general-purpose rocket in the world, ready for space stations, moon bases, Mars ships, whatever the future asked for. He was guarding against the exact thing that would eventually kill the program, and the safeguard was clever, and it still wasn't enough. Hold on to that, because it's the whole heart of the matter. To lift 100 tons, Glushko needed engines nobody had ever built, so he made them. Each of the 4 strap-on boosters carried a single engine called the RD-170, and it remains, to this day, the most powerful liquid-fuel rocket engine ever made. Each one put out around 1.5 million pounds of thrust. He got there by ganging 4 combustion chambers onto one set of pumps, which is how he beat the burn-through instability that had wrecked big single-chamber engines before it. The core stage was its own milestone, burning liquid hydrogen through a cluster of engines called the RD-0120, the first large hydrogen engines the Soviets ever flew, a technology the Americans had spent a decade and the whole Saturn program learning to tame. Every part of this machine sat at or past the edge of what anyone on Earth could do. The hardware was never the weak link, and here is where it comes apart, and it was already coming apart before the rocket ever left the ground. A rocket isn't really defined by its engines or its height. It's defined by its payload manifest, the actual list of things waiting to go up. Energia's manifest was, from the very start, close to empty. Strip away the fear of the shuttle and ask the plain question: what did the Soviet Union actually need to put 100 tons into orbit for? The answer, in 1976 and in 1986 and in 1993, was nothing anyone was paying for. The space stations they flew, Salyut and then Mir, went up on the old Proton rocket in modules that weighed 20 tons, not 100. No one had funded a moon base. Nothing pointed toward Mars. The one payload class that genuinely needed that kind of lift was the orbital weapons platform, the very thing they had accused the Americans of building, and I'll come back to that, because it is the darkest joke in the whole program. This is what capability without demand looks like. Energia was the most powerful rocket in the world, and it was born with no customers. Glushko's clever standalone design was supposed to spare it from being a one-mission machine, but a general-purpose heavy lifter still needs heavy things to carry, and the shelves were bare. The rocket's only guaranteed payload was Buran, and Buran's only real reason to exist was a threat that turned out not to be there. So the launcher hung off an orbiter that hung off a misunderstanding, and the day that link was made, years before anyone would say it out loud, the program was already over. Everything after was a magnificent machine performing perfectly for an audience that had no work for it. And look at everything raised up around this rocket. To move Energia's boosters and the Buran orbiter across the country, the Soviets built the largest airplane in history, the An-22-5, a 6-engine giant with a wingspan wider than the rocket was tall, and only one was ever finished. They put up new assembly halls and pads at Baikonur, sized for a vehicle that would use them twice. Glushko himself dreamed of riding this rocket to a permanent base on the moon, and drew up the plans, and the plans went nowhere, since no one would pay for the moon either. The full apparatus of a spacefaring superpower stood ready around a launcher that had nothing to launch. You can see the emptiness most clearly in what Energia carried the first time it flew, on May 15, 1987. What rode on top that day was a black cylinder, the weight of a loaded truck convoy, called Polyus, and Polyus was a prototype orbital battle station, carrying a laser the size of a small building, built to shoot down the missile defense satellites of Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. Take a second with that. The rocket the Soviets built because they feared the Americans would put weapons in orbit made its first flight carrying a Soviet weapon to put in orbit. The fear had turned itself inside out. I don't think there's a cleaner picture anywhere of how completely that misread had taken hold, and Polyus didn't even work. The rocket did its job perfectly, but after separation the platform was supposed to roll halfway around to aim its engine, and instead it rolled all the way around, fired in the wrong direction, and drove itself straight back down into the Pacific. The most powerful rocket in the world had flown a flawless debut. The thing it carried had failed on its own, and even if it had worked, it was a weapon nobody could afford, and in the end, nobody wanted. That leaves the one launch that fully succeeded, the Buran flight in 1988, the one this started with. Buran flew once, with no crew aboard, and it came down through a crosswind and put itself on the runway within a few yards of the center line, no pilot on board. An automated landing the American shuttle never once managed or was even wired to attempt. And then, like the rocket that lifted it, it was finished. So the entire operational record of the most powerful rocket the Soviet Union ever built comes to 2 flights, 1 dead weapon, and 1 orbiter that flew a single perfect lap and rolled into a hangar. That's the whole history, and not one bolt of it broke. There was simply nothing left to put on top. By the time all of this was undeniable, the country that could have carried a customerless super rocket on pride alone was running out of money, and then out of time. But there was still a serious, competent attempt to save the machine, and it deserves to be told straight, because the people who made it weren't fools. They understood the real problem. Energia was too big for any market that existed, so in the early 1990s, they tried to shrink it to fit one. The design was called Energia M. It kept the same architecture, with 2 boosters instead of 4, and a single core engine instead of the cluster, which brought the lift down to around 30 tons, into the range where actual payloads and actual customers might live. They built a full-scale mock-up. In 1993, they entered it into a government competition to become Russia's next heavy rocket. It was a rational, well-built bid, and it lost. There's something quietly deflating in that, to me, a team of brilliant people trying to talk their own masterpiece down to a size the world might actually buy. The contract went to a clean sheet design called Angara, from a rival bureau, a rocket that wouldn't actually reach the pad for more than 20 years, and honestly, there was no market waiting even for the smaller version. The commercial satellites of the 1990s weighed a few tons and flew on rockets that already existed. Nobody was lining up to buy 100 tons of lift, or 30, at what a rocket like this cost to fly. The whole Buran and Energia effort had swallowed roughly 20 billion rubles in a currency that was itself about to come apart. And I'm not going to pretend that converts into a clean dollar figure across the collapse of a currency and a country, so I'll just say it plainly. It was the most expensive thing the Soviet space program ever produced, and every ton of it was aimed at a demand that never arrived. Underneath the decision to let it go was an argument that was simply correct. Russia in the 1990s had almost no money for space. It had a workhorse fleet, the Proton and the Soyuz, that flew paying satellites and kept the whole enterprise alive. Money spent propping up a super heavy rocket with no customers was money pulled straight out of the vehicles that were earning their keep to preserve a capability the country had no present use for. Put that way, letting Energia die was the responsible thing to do. The people making that case weren't wrong, and that's the part that stings. The strongest rocket the Soviet Union ever flew was shut down by an argument nobody could honestly rebut. There was no explosion, no disaster, no failure. On June 30th, 1993, Boris Yeltsin signed the program out of existence. The flight hardware was left where it stood. The engines went into storage. The Energia M mock-up was rolled into a building at Baikonur and left there, a full-size rocket that would never fly, keeping company with the one Buran that had. There was no bang at the end of it. Just a tender lost, a budget line closed, and a hangar door pulled shut, which is how these things usually go. Let me lay out plainly why it failed. Start with the biggest, the one people almost never lead with. There was no demand. A launcher lives or dies on its manifest, and Energia's was empty from the day it was drawn up. It was built to a number, 100 tons to orbit, that no funded mission on Earth required. You can build the finest machine in the world, and if there's nothing for it to do, it is finished before it launches. The second cause was baked in from outside the program, past the reach of anyone who worked on it. Energia's only anchor payload was Buran, and Buran existed to answer a threat that had been misjudged. The reusable shuttle they feared turned out to be a budget-eating civilian vehicle, not a weapon, and by the time that was clear, it had already been built at staggering cost. When the reason for the orbiter evaporated, the reason for the rocket went with it. Third, the country that ordered it came apart. A customerless super rocket can survive for years inside a command economy that funds prestige for its own sake. It cannot survive inside a collapsing one that has to justify every ruble. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the machine no longer made sense. The fourth reason is the honorable one, and it's the one I keep getting stuck on. Keeping Energia alive would have meant starving the rockets that were flying real payloads and paying real bills. The people who let it go were protecting the workhorses that kept Russian spaceflight breathing. They made the right call, and I find that far harder to sit with than any blunder, because there is no one to be angry at, and nothing that should have gone differently. And underneath all of it sits the cruelest part. For all of Glushko's cleverness in making Energia general purpose instead of a one-mission machine, no second mission was ever funded. The safeguard never left the drawing board. On paper, the rocket could have done 100 different jobs, and in the real world, it was asked to do exactly one. None of this is a story about incompetence, and there is no villain in it anywhere. Glushko built a flawless rocket and the finest engine the world had ever seen. The engineers who tried to shrink it to a survivable size were reading the market correctly. The officials who let it die were guarding the money that kept everything else alive. Every one of them was doing something defensible, and the sum of all that defensible behavior was the most powerful rocket on the planet, flying twice and being thrown away, with the hardware flawless the entire way down. And here's the part that genuinely gets me. The part where the engineers have the last word after all. The rocket died, the engine didn't. That RD-170 Glushko, built for Energia's boosters, was so good it refused to stay buried with the program. A close variant, the RD-171, flew the Zenit rocket, including from a converted oil platform floating on the equator, a commercial venture called Sea Launch. A cut-down two-chamber version, the RD-180, was sold to the United States, and for 2 decades it powered the American Atlas V, flying more than 100 launches, including some of the most sensitive national security and spy satellite missions the United States ever put up. Another descendant, the single-chamber RD-191, flies on Russia's Angara today, the very rocket that beat Energia MAME back in 1993. One engine line, born for a Soviet super rocket built to counter an American weapon that never existed, ended up under an American rocket, lifting American military payloads for 20 years. There's a hard lesson in that. The rocket had no market, and it died. The engine had a market, and it flew more than 100 times for a foreign military. Both were superb, so it was never about quality. It came down to demand. The world had work for the engine, and none at all for the rocket. Even that afterlife is over now. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, leaning on a Russian engine for American national security launches became untenable, and after the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the supply was cut for good. The Atlas V is being retired. The line has closed on both sides, which means the most powerful liquid-fuel rocket engine ever built now has no successor flying anywhere. Its last descendants used up, the same way the rocket it was born for was used up. If you want to stand where the story ends, you go to Baikonur, out on the Kazakh steppe, and you find a hangar with a full-size Energium standing inside it. It is a complete rocket. Every stage is there. It was rolled in more than 30 years ago, and it has never moved, because the day it was finished there was nothing for it to carry, and there still isn't. It's a whole machine the world never found a use for, kept in the dark, waiting on a mission that was cancelled before it was born. The thing worth carrying out of a machine like this is that good engineering isn't enough on its own, and neither is good intention. The quiet corners of the space age are full of hardware that worked perfectly and had nowhere to go, but the ideas usually outlast the programs that abandon them. Glushko's engine is the proof, still burning under other flags long after the rocket and the country were gone. So if these half-buried corners of the space age pull at you the way they pull at me, the machines that got written off and the ones that outlived the people who shut them down, subscribe, and I'll keep bringing them up out of the dark, because there are far more of them down here than you would ever guess.